Good evening, everybody, and welcome again to another of our autumn or maybe winter now webinars that we've been running now for some time. And I hope you're all managing to deal with the slightly inclement weather that we seem to be having. Certainly our part of the world, it doesn't seem to be stopped raining since the end of September. But what I'm hoping is that we're going to talk about quite a lot more than just the weather this evening, because we're having a Holy TFA webinar tonight, which is a bit of a first. I think we were just talking earlier, we maybe ran one at the very start of these events when George Dunn, who many of you, well, all of you I'm sure will know, is our chief executive, hosted one about rent reviews with one of our advisors. So this is a bit different tonight. So hopefully we'll get some really good information. And really we're looking at the choices that face tenant farmers over the next 12 months. We're also joined, so George is here, and we'll talk a little bit about succession planning, negotiating agreements, potential loss of land, which I'm sure may be close to the heart of many of you now with the current new schemes. And we're also joined by Lynette Steele, who again, many of you will know is our farm policy advisor, who's going to cover ELMs, farm schemes, productivity grants, and sort of update on where we are. But a bit more than that, I think, is to look at how these fit in a tenanted situation. So that should be quite an interesting event, I think, this evening. As always, we are sponsored by Oxbury Bank, who many of you will now be familiar with, I hope, from the sponsorship that they've given us over the last year or so. They are kind of the new kids on the block in terms of finance and banking, founded in 2021 by bankers, farmers and technologists. And they're the only UK bank that's 100% dedicated to serving farmers, food producers in the rural economy. And it's really good, I think, from a tenant point of view, to have somebody like Oxbury to discuss finance options and banking with. So head over to their website to take a look and see if they might be able to help you or see what they do. Also, a quick reminder that the webinar tonight is recorded. Once it's been edited, it'll be available on our TFA YouTube channel, which you can find at Tenant Farmers. And obviously, we've got all the previous webinars on there, the last few of which, and the most sort of popular ones, seem to be the regular DEFRA, ELMS and SFI updates. The webinar we did about trees not being the only way, so simple steps to improve soil carbon, which many of you recall we did that in the summer, and that was really interesting about, again, how that carbon environment fits for tenants. So, sorry, and I should also say, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your screen, I think, or depending on what you're looking at this on. But please use the Q&A rather than the chat, so we can pick those up. We've had quite a number of questions sent in ahead of the event, and we'll try, as always, to pick up all of the questions that have been asked. And I'm sure we'll fail, as always, to answer them all. But where we don't, we'll put them on the website, and we, both Lynette and George, will be happy to pick those up. So we're going to go over initially, without further ado, to Lynette. Just by way of introduction, Lynette joined the TFA as a farm policy advisor in 2018. She farms in her own right alongside her husband on a tenanted arable holding in Hampshire, where she plays an integral part in running the business. So really has her foot in both camps. So it's really useful to have Lynette with us, working for us in the TFA on policy. She's going to talk us through payment delinking, the current farm schemes and the grants that are available to us. So thank you very much for giving up your hour, Lynette, and we look forward to hearing what you've got to say about what we can all do with the new schemes. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Mark. Yeah, so this evening I'm going to give you just a general policy update about the agricultural transition plan, which George eloquently put, as always, earlier this week. I think is fair to say it's stuttering at the moment to get going. It's been 3 years since it was brought into action. And I have to say the number of calls we've been having from members from all over the country, from every sector, every size farm. I think it's fair to say that now we are really, really starting to see the effects that the changes in agricultural policy is having on farm businesses. So first of all, I wanted to just touch on BPS, as this year will be the last year that we claim for BPS. And it will cease at the end of this year, and our payments, which will still be received until 2027, will move to the de-linking payment system. On the face of it, little will change. We'll still receive those half-yearly payments in August and December, but with a percentage reduction. And they will be received until 2027, when that area-based payment will end entirely. And hopefully that comes as no shock to any of you. Payment statements from the RPA are currently being sent out to claimants about each individual business's de-linking value. And I cannot stress enough that it's really important that you check those statements thoroughly to ensure the RPA have the correct information relating to your business. The way to check those statements will be to ensure that the reference period figures are correct and correspond with the amount of subsidy you received during the reference period, which was 2020 to 2022. Any queries with those statements need to be raised with the RPA straight away. The deadline for raising these queries is the 29th of February 24. And at the moment, I'm unsure what capability they will have to review those statements after that date, if any at all. Ultimately, these statements will define your payments over the next 4 years of the scheme. So that's why it is absolutely vital that that piece of paper from the RPA is not just put into a pile, but it is thoroughly checked and put somewhere safe so that it can be referred to in the future if needed. Now, when we talk about de-linking, there will be an opportunity to transfer this reference data, this reference period that I've just spoken about, to a different business. And that transfer window will be open from the 15th of February to the 10th of May. So it's quite a short window, and it's a one-off window as well. A transferring business will need to obviously have an SBI number and hold that reference data. And a receiving business will need to also have an SBI number, but more vitally, they will have had to have made a valid claim for BPS in 2023, even if that was for a very small area. The reason the RPA have allowed this one-off transfer window is mainly to allow those businesses that have undergone structural changes, such as mergers or splits, to be eligible for a de-linked payment while their business continues. There is also the ability in inheritance cases that reference data can be transferred to another business or a new business if the case has gone through the relevant inheritance requirements. For tenants, where you've lost land which you've previously claimed on during that reference period, the de-linked payment remains the right of the tenant. So that's the person who was claiming those entitlements during the reference period. And to receive the de-linked payments, you do not need to still have management control of that land between 2024 and 2027. However, we have had a few cases where there seems to be some confusion over who claims those delinked payments and how they're handled. Obviously, a lot of tenancy agreements, when they were written up, didn't consider the demise of BPS and the delinking policy. First and foremost, it's really important to understand that those delinking, that entitlements have now ended. You can't transfer entitlements back to your landlord if they were once with your landlord. Like I said, delinking payments stay with the tenant who claimed them at the time. So if you are in that position, I would advise you to give us a call. We'll have a look at your tenancy agreement and see what the terms of the tenancy are regarding BPS and potentially whether there are any clauses written in there to address the end of the scheme. So please don't be bullied, I suppose, into making any sort of payment to a landlord without first consulting us about what position you're in. So next slide, please, Julia. Moving on to the sustainable farming incentive. Hopefully by now you have at least a basic understanding of the scheme and what actions agreement holders will have to undertake to receive a payment through SFI. The main points that members should be considering when looking at the scheme are what options are achievable without really needing to change your farming system. So that might be including herbal lays in your pasture to take advantage of the £382 per hectare payment, or increasing buffer strips on less productive areas of land, which has a payment rate of £451 per hectare on arable land. I think when you look at that realistically, costing that against potentially your spring cropping gross margins, for example, it's worth looking to see whether there are more attractive alternative options available to you and your farming system without really having to change too much. The viability and flexibility of the scheme on your land. SFI, as I'm sure know, is a 3-year agreement, but has the scope to increase the agreement criteria and area annually. This means for those of you which are a little cautious, you can enter a percentage of your land now and then increase the area throughout the agreement. This gives you far more flexibility than we've had in other agri-environment schemes. And also the quarterly payments at the end of each quarter will help with the cash flow throughout the year. So that's got to be a positive as well. I really wanted to reiterate that what the offer is at the moment is just the starting point. The 23 standards which are available today will increase over the next 2 years. And we're expecting additional standards for moorlands and uplands to come in, water body buffering, agroforestry, organic standards, etc. And the payments rate should also be reviewed annually to ensure they are timely and relevant. However, I am going to put a disclaimer in here that I'm not saying that I'm guaranteeing that they're going to increase. I'm just saying they're going to be reviewed. We are expecting a policy announcement. We were expecting one before the end of the year about which standards will be brought in 2024. However, given the news this week that we have a new Secretary of State in the department and some changes, whether we see that before Christmas or into the new year now, we're not quite sure at the moment. I suppose it depends on how quickly Steve Barclay gets up and running. However, and unfortunately there is a however, I wish there wasn't, the application process is throwing up some issues at the moment, which members are reporting. Predominantly, the main issue is applying the right standards to the correct field parcels. The crux of the matter is that the RPA system is working off two sets of data for land use and land cover. And where these two aren't compatible, then then eligible land parcels are being classed as ineligible. So when you go to click on a standard for a field parcel, it's saying that it's ineligible when you full well know it's actually eligible. If this problem is affecting you, I recommend you go back and look at your land cover and land use codes on the mapping page of your RPA portal. Where the land cover needs to be changed, that can be done by an RLE1 form, or if it's less than 5 parcels, you can ring the RPA and change it over the phone. For anybody who's looking for additional guidance on that, I will publish some links and some details about how you can do that. Ideally, you do it at the beginning of your application, so when you get to the standards part of the application, you don't hit that barrier. Some other questions another question that's frequently being asked is about the hedgerow management options. The RPA have confirmed that hedgerows do not need to be mapped during the application process. So if your hedgerows aren't showing correct on the maps, don't worry about it. Just input the length of hedges that you have to enter into each of those hedgerow standards. And no further evidence is required at the stage of application. It might be that the RPA require that information, which you will be asked to update again via an RLE1 form in the future. But at this stage, you don't need to worry about it. And another one, which is become quite frustrating that we haven't had an answer on, is whether rotational options are claimed in advance or retrospectively of the cropping year. This is something we've been asking for clarity on now for some time, because it will enable us to make a more informed decision at the point of application, whether we're claiming in advance or retrospectively for those rotational options. So that's, for example, like your wild bird seed mixes. We are expecting a policy decision again on that, and hopefully that won't have to wait for a full ministerial meeting to be signed off. So we are pushing very hard on that, on getting an answer to that. If anybody isn't fully aware of SFI, I would really recommend that you look at our previous webinar from 2 months ago, I believe it was, when Janet Hughes and Marie Hardiman from the RPA attended. They did a good job of talking through SFI 23. And of course, I'm in the office and can help with any queries that you have regarding the scheme. Just to touch on countryside stewardship, it will return next year, and we are expecting some new options to become available, which will focus on large area projects, such as catchment zones and water buffering, for example. We should hear more on this again either towards the end of this year or the beginning of 2024 before the application windows open next year. One thing we do know is DEFRA are very keen to design a scheme which encourages collaboration and delivery on a larger scale. However, they're focusing on how they can deliver these environmental goals through individual farm agreements, so that farmers do not necessarily have to put together a clustered group joint agreement. And so they're just figuring out how that will work. And hopefully we'll get some more detail on that soon. The next slide, please, Julia. So then it would be remiss of me not to mention landscape recovery, which is the third tier of ELMS. The second round has just closed for applications. These large-scale projects, as I'm sure you know, are aimed to deliver long-term environmental goals. From a tenancy point of view, landlord consent will be required for the majority of those schemes, as there'll be 30-year plus agreements. However, one thing I just wanted to mention regarding landscape recovery was that I've had quite a few questions lately from members saying that landlords or cluster groups are wanting to use your SBI number, and whether that can affect your claims at all. I just wanted to reassure everyone that by giving your SBI number to your landlord or to a cluster group coordinator who put together these applications, they can't sign you up to the scheme without your express consent. What they're doing essentially is just making an application for funding during the discovery phase, which is the first 2-year phase of the landscape recovery scheme. So I just wanted to reassure everybody there on that. So moving on to productivity funded grants, which have been ongoing now for 2 years, so should be quite familiar to the majority of you. And despite, unfortunately, despite repeat lobbying from DEFRA, from us, sorry, to DEFRA, they don't seem to be able to give us a long-term view on when these grants become available, and they kind of just pop up one day that they're open, which is really frustrating from a business planning perspective. The second round of the Slurry Infrastructure Grant is due to open any day now. And although recommendations of the ROC review and conversations with ourselves, we asked for the ability for joint landlord and tenant applications to be accepted for this scheme. DEFRA has decided that they can't accept those joint applications, and that the burden of application and agreement will stay with the tenant. This is disappointing, as slurry storage is predominantly, but not in all cases, a landlord responsibility, and investment in storage capacity is not really high on many landlords' lists, but is an issue which are facing tenants daily, especially with additional pressure from the Environment Agency at the moment. However, the good news is that unlike in round one of the scheme, the high priority areas are set to be increased, and DEFRA are encouraging those even outside those high priority areas to make an application for funding. I think in the first round, about 30% of successful applications came from outside those high priority areas. So please don't dismiss the scheme just because you're not in one of those high priority areas. Other grants currently open for application are the Carve Housing Grant, which closes at the end of this month. To date, there's been a really high level of interest in the scheme. However, interestingly, we are seeing the expression of interest for the majority of these productivity schemes are high. But actually the number that convert into full application, I suppose as expected, declines. And in some instances, we've actually seen DEFRA have gone back out to people they've previously rejected and reoffered agreements to those who were originally turned down. So we're keeping an eye on that. For those eagle-eyed of you, you'll see I've also got solar on the bottom of this slide here. We are expecting a solar grant to come out next year under productivity funding. I have very few details on that at the moment, but just please note, if you're considering an investment, watch this space. Next slide, please, Julia. So I just wanted to flag, I suppose, one major deadline. One has already passed for the deadline to claim for the Farming Equipment Technology Fund Productivity and Slurry funding. That was the 7th of November. Hopefully everybody got their claims in. If you were awarded a grant under the Animal Health and Welfare, the deadline is the 5th of December. Please make sure that you meet that deadline, as claiming retrospectively is really tricky for these grants. Then we move, I just wanted to touch on new entrant schemes, and that's the next slide. Thanks, Julia. Unfortunately, this scheme isn't only stuttering, but is all but stopped since the pilot ran earlier this year, which is disappointing, as currently there's no support for young farmers and new entrants, despite recommendations of the ROC review. So the pilot only focused on advice, and the Rockview and ourselves have asked for support in advice, finance, and access to land. Once again, the TFA are calling for the BPS eligibility criteria to be removed from the SFI scheme to at least allow new entrants to take part in those environmental schemes, to gain some additional funding. And I also just wanted to mention the Animal Health and Welfare Review that is continuing and is ongoing and accepting applications throughout the year. There have been some teething issues with this scheme, predominantly that vets don't seem to have the resources to carry out the review and file the required paperwork to allow farmers to make those claims. But I definitely advise people that the money is there. The application process is quite simple. So please speak to your vet if you're looking at carrying out your annual health review, either for a red tractor assurance or just anyway. It's at least worth asking the questions. And I think that's about it. I realise I'm running out of time. But finally, just a quick mention about cross compliance. Again, we're expecting an announcement now soon regarding regarding how that the cross compliant regulations will come into statutory law, as cross compliance as we know it ends in 2024. So it's just worth noting there will be a change there, not particularly anything for people to be worried about, but just kind of a note to think about. I'm really sorry, Mark, I ran over slightly, but hopefully that's a whistle-stop tour of where we are on policy.
That's brilliant, Lynette. Thanks very much. I'm glad to see someone else's timekeeping is slightly worse than mine, possibly. But I think what that actually highlights on a more serious note is that there are a huge amount of things out there for us to kind of get involved with, but just sort of get your head around and see where they fit within your business. There's kind of something for everybody. I think you can pick that up from what Lynette has said. But you really need to think about how does it fit in your business. And I thought you made a really pertinent comment right at the start, Lynette, about where SFI fits, and actually look and see how it fits within your business rather than make your business fit SFI, I guess. I think that's really important. But I think it is something we all need to be looking at, and there's quite a few questions around that which we'll pick up after we've heard from George. Obviously, we'll go straight over to George Dunn, who, as I say, most of you will, I'm sure, recognise and know as our Chief Executive. It doesn't seem any time since we were celebrating George's 25th year as our Chief Executive, but my notes for this evening tell me that he's been here nearly 27 years now. So that's a huge commitment to the tenanted sector. And it would be remiss of me not to mention a recent award that George won, which was the Farmer's Guardian contribution to British agriculture, which is well deserved, and a real recognition of the work that George does on our behalf. I think we're going to hear from him tonight about all of those things that he talks to people and lobbies on our behalf about. So I won't waste any more time and go straight over to George. And thank you for joining us, George, tonight.
Thanks, Mark. Can you just confirm that you can see my screen?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so I shall begin. So really good to be with you all this evening. Thanks, Lynette, for your amazing run through of where we are on schemes. Thanks, Mark, for your kind remarks introducing me. What I'm going to try and do is to think about what the future might hold for our businesses, our members' businesses, and what considerations need to be given to making decisions about change in businesses. And normally when we have discussions with our members about this sort of stuff, the first thing we say is, what does your tenancy agreement say? And here's an example on the screen of a tenancy agreement. Yes, it might be a bit mucky, a bit dog-eared, but this regulates the relationship as between you and the landlord. And this is really where we've got to go to begin to understand what you can and can't do and what responsibilities and privileges and benefits that you have. So we really need, as a first position, to understand our tenancy agreements. and I say this, you might think flippantly, but it's actually quite important, preferably before they are signed, so that you understand what you're signing up for before you put your ink on the paper. Very often we find situations where people have signed agreements without actually properly understanding what's in them. And the other thing that happens quite often is that tenancy agreements get lost. So do you know where your tenancy agreement is? It is another question that we ask. And if you don't, then it would be a good opportunity after tonight's webinar to go and try and find where your tenancy agreement is. Sometimes tenancy agreements are oral, and we still find oral agreements. And there are some fortunate individuals who find that they've got an oral agreement under the 1986 Agricultural Holdings Act, which effectively allows them to assign their tenancy to even a company, which makes that tenancy viable for forever, for as long as that company remains solvent. And obviously, oral agreements, by their nature, have fewer restrictions than written agreements. So an oral agreement can be quite a valuable piece of paper, so long as it is a proper oral tenancy. And we can advise you on that if you can't find or you don't think there is an existing agreement for your holding. There are lots of things to look out for, though, in terms of making changes to your farm and making changes to your business. And one of the things that quite often comes up is agricultural use only clauses. And these are very familiar and very common in tenancy agreements where tenants are restricted to agricultural use only. The definition of agriculture between the AHA, the Agricultural Holdings Act, and the Agricultural Tenancies Act are identical, and it's written there for you so you can see it in full detail. What I would say is that it is what you would think would be traditional agriculture, but also in addition to that, we have something called the Rules of Good Husbandry, which apply to tenancies under the 86 Act, the old style tenancies. These rules were written back in 1947, so they have a very post-war feel about them, and talk about maximizing the reasonable standard of efficient production on the holding. And we have seen these rules used against tenants who have, for example, tried to have bushier hedgerows than they would otherwise have had for agricultural purposes in order to benefit the environment. They are ripe, in our view, for review and reform, and it's something which certainly Baroness Kate Rock in her review also recommended via a potential piece of work by the Law Commission. So watch out for agricultural use only clauses, because that might prevent you from doing quite a lot of things. There are also what they're called alienation clauses, which prevent you from subletting or parting with possession or even sharing possession of the holding. And sometimes people come forward with really interesting schemes or joint venture arrangements which may fall foul of alienation clauses within an agreement. So look out for clauses which might prevent you to do that. Also, consider what the landlord's reserved rights are in your agreement. Normally, at the front of the agreement or in a schedule at the back, there will be a whole list of things that the landlord is reserving out of the agreement. I mean, an obvious one is sport. So don't think about setting up a commercial shoot on the farm if the landlord has already reserved the sporting rights, for example. But it could be other things. It could be water, it could be trees, it could be access, it could be film rights. On an awful lot of National Trust farms, for example, the National Trust reserves the rights to filming. So if you do happen to live in a very iconic or beautiful spot of the country and you think you might be good for filming, the landlord may have already reserved those rights. So just watch out for things like that in the agreement. Watch out for clauses defining the farmer, particularly we were having conversations with people about whether they should incorporate their businesses or go into partnership or have share farming. Some of the clauses defining the farmer might restrict you from making those changes. Some tenancies still have restrictions on people working off the holding, particularly county council small holding tenancies have some of those. Look out for the repairs and maintenance clauses. We always say they're a bit like a fingerprint. Every agreement is different in terms of how repairs and maintenance play. So don't think just because your neighbor has got a particular way of repairs and maintenance being allocated in their agreement, it applies in yours. It quite likely won't be the case because you've probably got quite a unique agreement. If you need to add fixed equipment to the holding or change fixed equipment on the holding, there may be clauses which require you to seek landlord's consent for that. There may even be clauses which prevent you entering into some of the schemes that Lynette's been talking about just now. There are certainly lots of agreements which prevent you bringing in third-party stock. So we're having conversations with members who want to go out of dairy, for example, and are thinking about using the holdings for raising young stock from other dairy farmers in the locality. So a third-party stock restriction might cause you problems in that respect. Each agreement will have differences around meeting statutory standards. So we talked about slurry in our grants. Those standards might be the landlord to comply with, or they might be for you to comply with. So watch out for issues around that. Some agreements, again, local authority agreements, might prevent you from taking on additional land. And don't forget, and this is always the case, that in terms of consent, all of these things are able to be changed by agreement with the landlord. But obviously the landlord sometimes will have an ulterior motive before they decide to grant consent. So there might be a cottage on the holding that the landlord's wanted back since the 1980s, and you haven't been prepared to give it up, and the price that the landlord wants for giving you consent for some of this is to give that cottage back to the estate. You know what I'm talking about. There will always be something behind the scenes which might give the landlord an ulterior motive. But all these things can change. All I would say is make sure that you record all those changes in writing. Don't assume just because you've done it orally that that'll be enough. You need to make sure that all changes are in writing. Lynette's been talking a lot about schemes, and I thought it would just be worthwhile running through some scheme design issues that the ROC review has been talking about and are still in play. And I know Mark, is our representative on the Farm Tenancy Forum, is talking about these at the next meeting of the forum in December. So what the things that we're trying to embed in stewardship and in other schemes are, firstly, the tenants shouldn't have to have landlord's consent if their tenancy agreements doesn't restrict them from entering schemes without consent. We're saying that landlords should not be allowed to enter tenanted land into schemes unilaterally. Previously, we have had landlords entering schemes without tenants' consent. And where schemes require timelines which are longer than the tenancy in place, tenants who are expecting to retain occupation, in our view, should be able to unilaterally join schemes so long as they're not otherwise falling foul of the nature of their agreements. We're saying that landlords should only be allowed to enter tenanted land in jointly with the tenant, and we've just had some discussion about that, and then only with the consent of the tenant. We don't want the tenant to be forced in any way. We also want there to be adequate protections to stop land being taken back in hand and subsequently entered into schemes by landlords. We're seeing that with some of the SFI options. We're seeing that for woodland planting. And the ROC review had the idea of a quarantine period of a year without the landlord being able to access public funding if the land's being taken back from the tenanted sector. And where we have tenant farmers who are on multiple occupation agreements, they should be able to enter on all the land that they can rather than all the land that they farm. And we need the flexibility for land to be added or removed without penalty to reflect tenancy changes. We need those agreements to be assignable to incoming tenants, and we need landscape recovery not to be adversely affecting tenants. Now, a lot of this stuff has already been agreed within the SFI framework, but we're now having discussions about how we bring those into stewardship and how we bring those into other schemes like Fitball, how we bring them into the productivity schemes, etc. I'm really pleased that Baroness Kate Rock continues to be a strong advocate for this. And the forum is certainly working on this to see what changes can be made. So what if my landlord says no when I need consent, for example, to enter a scheme? Well, if you're a tenant under the 86 Act, you'd be happy to know that there are provisions within legislation which allow you to formally object to your landlord's unreasonable refusal to allow access to a government financial assistance scheme. However, if you're under an Agricultural Tenancies Act 1995 agreement in England, there is no such ability for you to object to your landlord's unreasonable consent. Again, this is something that Baroness Kate Rock had suggested should be changed within England, but nothing yet forthcoming from England. Happily, in Wales, in the Agricultural Wales Act of this year, there are similar provisions for 1985 Act tenancies as under the 86 Act. We're just waiting for the regulations to come forward to bring those into play. A few final comments, Mark, and then we'll go to questions. Just in terms of rent reviews and tenders, we're getting a lot of questions from members about rent reviews at the moment and tenders. We are looking at how rents need to adjust for the new economic environment, and certainly what we're concerned about is making sure that people who are bidding on FBTs, for example, are bidding prudently, because those rents impact the rents that everybody pays. So watch out for that. Succession and long-term FBTs. What I mean by this is on succession, we're getting a lot of questions from members who are of an age who are looking to pass the businesses down to the next generation. We have some changes in the succession rules coming next year, which will mean that what we've called the commercial unit test is disappearing, but there will be a higher bar for suitability. But we're also seeing a lot of landlords being willing to agree to long-term FBTs rather than going for formal successions. And those terms can be agreed on quite reasonable bases. So don't turn down a long-term FBT if it's offered out of hand, because it might save you a shed load of stress and money having to go to the tribunal to argue for your succession. And finally, surrenders. You know, we're having a lot of discussion with members around surrenders. Some states are prepared to pay for surrenders. Some, like local authority landlords, aren't. But it's certainly something, if you are thinking that the game's up for you and you want to get out, it's something that can be negotiated, but you need to be really shrewd about how you do that, and we can help you in terms of taking that forward. However, in all of these discussions that we're having, you know, what we need is building relationships between landlords and tenants and having communication. And I would venture to suggest that what the chap is doing on his laptop on the left of your screen, my screen, is not building relationships. What's happening on the right-hand side is more of the building of relationships. But then everything needs to be communicated in writing after those discussions are taking place. Because the thing that we want to avoid is massive disputes. And this image sums it up for me. This is an image called The Lawsuit. And you can see there's two lean and hungry individuals called plaintiff and defendant who are pulling at a cow from both ends. And the solicitor there in the front is milking it for all it's worth. And the judge seems to be doing quite well on it as well behind that cow. So the only people that really gain from these types of disputes are, sadly, the professionals. And so anything that we can do to build a more collegiate, collaborative way forward saves money, stress, time, and energy, and hopefully a bigger pie for everybody to take advantage of going forward. So that's a quick run through for me, Mark, which hopefully will spark a few questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
That's great, George, as ever. Loads of good points to remember, and I should just remind people that this the webinar is available on the website and the TFA, on the YouTube channel. So for those of you who want to go back and look at those slides and maybe remind yourselves what you need to remember, particularly like where is your tenancy agreement, that's quite a good one. It's got me thinking, to be fair. So there's just a lot of things to think about in all of that around tenancies. And I think your last slide there about communication and collaboration, I've said for a long time, and we've said as an organisation for a while now, that one of the things that the new environment, if you like, offers in terms of the schemes that Lynette talked about, and just the changing way in which farming is having to operate, actually does give a really good opportunity for landlords and tenants to collaborate in order to make the most of the opportunities there are out there. So I think we would certainly, as a starting point, as George said there, encourage people to talk to their landlords and talk to their agents and try and get some discussion going before either one party sort of jumps off the cliff in one direction or another, because there's a lot of things out there that we need to kind of negotiate, I think, at the moment. So that's a really good. Maybe everybody should have a picture of that up on the wall, because there's only a couple of people benefiting from that, and it's neither you or the landlord. Anyway, I'll crack on. I'm conscious, as always, we probably won't get through all of these questions, but I'm sure we will answer these and put them on the website. So Encourage you again, if you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A. But I'm gonna start with one probably for you, George, which is you've mentioned the ROC review in your presentation there, and we've got a question from a member in Dorset who's asking, will the next government implement the ROC review recommendations as part of their manifesto?
Well, that does rather require me to make a prediction about who the next government is going to be. I suppose we can assume it's either going to be the Conservatives or it's going to be Labour. At the moment, it looks like it's Labour, although there's a long time to go before we have an election and things can change quite rapidly. What I can say is we've been having discussions with the Labour party for a while, and Daniel Zeichner, who's the shadow farming minister, has been very close to the work that the ROC review has been doing. And I attended a meeting with him a little while ago, and he had the recommendations, all 74 recommendations in front of him, with ticks beside each one saying, yeah, we're going to do this when we come into power. So the Labour Party is signed up to the ROC review. What's been really good as well is that Keir Starmer, when he's been giving speeches and writing articles in relation to what he thinks about farming, he has referenced the tenanted sector and he has referenced the ROC review in those remarks. So the fact that the leader of the opposition is talking about not just agriculture, but the tenanted sector, and not just the tenanted sector, but the recommendation of the ROC review, I think is a good measure. And I know from what I did with the ROC review that Steve Barclay has been briefed on the ROC review as he's now come into the role of Secretary of State for DEFRA, because he was Cabinet Office Minister at the time as part of the right round that the government has to do to get agreement across all the departments for agreeing to stuff. He was heavily involved in that. And so he's at least been blooded by the recommendations. And I know Kate Rock has been very keen to make sure that he is aware of the briefing that he had previously. So, I think there's commitment from both of the main parties to deliver, probably a bit more from the Labour Party in terms of their position, but easy to promise in opposition things that you don't deliver in government. We need to be clear about that. But we think that both parties are certainly not backing away from the ROC review.
Yeah. Okay. And that, I think there are so many good recommendations in the review, which reflect where a lot of us are, I think, in terms of how we can make, and not least, going back to collaboration and trying to get a situation out there where landlords and tenants are really working together on these things. Just moving on a little bit, maybe this is a question that perhaps both of you could ask. We've got a member asking from the East Riding of Yorkshire, asking whether we see rent rates coming down as the subsidy is lost. Again, it's quite an open question, but I wonder, whether we do see that, and perhaps more directly to you, Lynette, around SFI, is where does SFI and these schemes, where does that fit into rent negotiations? And as tenants, how should we be looking at those SFI income when we're talking about rent and putting budgets and stuff together? Because it's quite a lot more complicated than just what is my BPS on the holding.
Shall I kick off first on that one, and then Lynette can follow on? So we have always said that there's an old-fashioned premise that the landlord's return on land is rent. So the landlord is entitled to rent, and the rent should be based on the ability of a tenant to profit from the holding. And the tenant's ability to profit from the holding will be an amalgam of the money that they get for selling their crops and stock, the money that they get from government schemes, and anything else that comes in by way of diversification income or whatever. And that should be the basis upon which a tenant is able to pay rent. So we can't get away from the fact that all of these payments in some way will have an impact on the level of rent that is being paid for land. And particularly as the way in which rents are reviewed, you have to take into consideration rents being paid on comparable holdings, other holdings. more so for FBTs than 86 Act agreements, but nevertheless, they're both still in there. So I think inevitably we're always going to see something of the money received through subsidy reflected in rental payments. But it is very true to say that the level of risk that tenants are having to bear going forward is going to be massively increased when you consider that the money is going to come through things like SFI or country stewardship or FIPL or something else, in comparison to BPS, which was effectively just having land at your disposal, putting in an application in May and getting a payment in December, or now twice a year, and that's going to disappear over a period of time. So I think on the grounds that the money is going to get tighter, and particularly in Wales, and we've seen that with the habitat scheme being such a lower value product than glass tier, which is coming to an end at the end of this year. So the money's going to get tighter, which would indicate that rents should be coming down, and the risk that tenants are bearing is going to be higher, which means that tenants should be able to retain more of the benefit of the schemes going forward as well. So I think there will be room for rent reductions going forward. We just need to manage the expectations, because it's going to take a while to come through, and the ship's going to take a while to turn around. But over the next 3 years, certainly, I think rents, particularly on FBTs, will be falling considerably.
Okay.
Yeah, and just one thing I'd also add to that is obviously with SFI and any schemes that I've talked about this evening on farm, is the tenant will be required to manage those schemes. So there will be a management cost in there as well, which obviously we don't have when we look at area-based payments. So that's something that will also need to be considered. Because there are going to be those management costs as well. So yeah, definitely we should see them come down in the future, but we'll wait and see for the tides to turn, and there's far more factors that need to be considered when we look at those.
Yeah, I don't think, Mark, they're going to fall off a cliff. So we're not going to see a massive reduction. It's going to take a while for those reductions to come through. But I think the pressure will build and build over the next few years. So I think people should be preparing for having those arguments.
Okay. Yeah, and I guess from a point of view of looking at entering into the schemes, you've got to be mindful of what would the typical tenant do in terms of looking at your rent. And if you're thinking, well, I'm going to take it easy and stick everything into wild bird seed, your agent may have a different view if he thinks you can produce high value potatoes on the land or whatever. Okay, I'm just going to move on a little bit more to the touch on a couple of the specifics of SFI. Two of which, if I'll lump two together, Lynette, if that's okay, because I think these touch on areas that are a concern in terms of moving from BPS to SFI. So the first one is regarding inspections, I guess. It's a member from Dorset who says the SFI guidance seems to be quite vague on how options have to be established and managed. Is there going to be further guidance to ensure that we don't have issues with inspectors? So maybe, well, let's pick that one up first. Where should we be looking when we're looking at these schemes about the impact of inspectors? Because we've all heard those anecdotal stories, and we've all probably got evidence of the RPA man coming in to inspect and losing all our BPS or whatever. Where's that going to sit? Because I think the member from Dorset here is quite correct in that some of the guidance is pretty vague in a kind of, this is how we're going to measure it, is, did you think it worked? Now, whether I think it would work or you did might be two different things.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a grey area here that at the moment we haven't seen play through, because SFI inspections haven't really yet happened on a scale that we can say, look, this is the tact the inspectors are taking. However, the policy surrounding it is that we no longer have inspectors. They're now field officers, and they should be there to support and advise farmers. So when they do come out on farm, they won't be looking to penalise you like they have previously with these schemes. And where there has been a lost hectare here or there, that you've received a 3% fine straight away, there will be opportunity for you to rectify any issues there are before they move to potentially money recovery first of all, and then if it's still not rectified, a fine system. So there should be far more support and advice. One thing I would say to members, very similar to George, with any changes to tenancy agreements, is please keep a record of all activity you carry out on the land which relate to any sort of environmental schemes, even if that's just a photo of you drilling the ground on a certain day and then it being established and coming through. Even if it gets droughted out later in the year, at least you've got evidence there to say it was established, and you know, that here's the seed ticket, for example, to demonstrate that. In those cases, when we come up against the RPA, photographic evidence and receipts, anything like that, is absolutely invaluable, and it is very difficult for us to argue on behalf of a member that doesn't have that evidence, because we end up in a he said, she said situation. So please make sure your records are up to date. Take agronomic advice where and if required, is the best advice I can kind of offer at this stage. And hopefully in 6 to 12 months' time, we'll see a far more supportive system rather than a penalising system.
And we're not expecting more guidance to come out, are we? We're kind of, the flexibility that the schemes are allowing is sort of encouraging us, or encouraging everybody to sort of behave reasonably, if you like, both us and inspectors, I guess. So it is a bit of a judgment, isn't it?
It absolutely is, and the reason that I suppose it's been left quite open is because DEFRA have recognised that every farm is different, so that the farmer knows how best to achieve the outcomes of the scheme, which is a good thing. I think the problem is we've been conditioned over the years that we have to abide by the scheme. So that's why it's going to take a bit of a culture change for us to get used to the new position, really.
Yeah. Okay. And then just maybe we've got a question about the budget. This is a member from Yorkshire saying, I've been told by an agent that I need to enter SFI before the budget runs out, but I was led to believe that the application window is open all year. Is this a now or never scheme, and is the budget likely to run out? George, you may also have a bit to add here about where we go after this Parliament in terms of budgets, but perhaps we could just cover that between the two of you.
Yeah, so the budget for SFI is not a problem at the moment. The government have legal targets to try and get 70% of farmland into these schemes. So it's up to them to make sure the budget is there. And we have no concerns at the moment that we're going to reach any sort of budgetary limit, although it does seem to be something that a few members have raised with us, and a bit of an industry rumour going around. So I'd like to assure everybody that that's not a concern we have at the moment. The scheme will remain open throughout the year for applicants. So you please don't feel like you have to rush or there's any time pressure there at all. We will be given notice should we at any point reach a budget limit, but like I say, it's not something we're expecting to happen anytime soon.
And I think, Mark, just to counter that a little bit, although I agree entirely with Lynette about where we are at the moment, but as you rightly said in your question, we only have a commitment from the government up to the end of this current Parliament, which is 2024. And as Lynette rightly says, there's no indication from any of the major parties that they're going to row back on funding. But it could be the case that we find ourselves in a different financial framework come the next Parliament. And obviously we and others will be lobbying to make sure that the commitments made to the industry are fulfilled beyond 2024. But just to sound a bit of a warning bell, we are already seeing budget impacts in Wales. So if you listen to Leslie Griffiths, the Welsh Minister, talking about the constraints on her and the government in terms of bringing forward the new Habitat Wales scheme, the reason why it is as constrained as it is because the Welsh Government's budget has been cut by the UK Exchequer, and we are seeing budget concerns. Now, there was some questions in the Senate this week around whether the BPS for 24 is protected in terms of the budget, and she couldn't even give that commitment. She said she was working hard to make sure that it was protected. So whilst I would absolutely agree with Lynette, there's no question of any changes within England, we've got to be mindful of the fact that things can change quite quickly, and the Welsh Government have certainly found themselves in a tricky position, because of the way in which their grant and aid operates from Westminster. So we're always going to have to be on guard.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you both very much for that. As always, we've run out of time, or we've run over time. So apologies to anybody who needed to get off at 8. And as always, we've not managed to cover all of the questions that have been raised, which are with some really good questions in here. So apologies to those people that have sent questions in, but rest assured we will get them answered, and we will put those answers on the website. So please keep an eye out, visit the website, and keep in touch. And as always, if you've got specific questions, give the head office a ring. As you know, we've got a great team of advisors who are there to help us out with questions that we may have. So thank you very much to George, and thank you, Lynette, for giving your time up this evening to cover those topics. Just a reminder that the next webinar is on the 13th of December, and it's reimagining the landlord-tenant relationship in agriculture. We have touched this evening on improving relationships and collaboration between landlords and tenants, and we'll be joined by Paul Sedgwick, who's the Deputy Ranger and the Managing Director of the Crown Estate, well, the Windsor and Rural Estate, the Crown Estate. George and I were fortunate enough to spend some time with Paul and have a look around the estate, and I think what they're doing across their whole estate now is quite refreshing. So I would encourage you to come and listen to what Paul has to say. And we'll also be joined by Alistair Martin, who's the Secretary and Keeper of Records of the Duchy of Cornwall, of the Prince of Wales's estate. And Alistair also, I think, has some very good examples of where landlord-tenant relationships really do get made to work, and also how they're trying to make them work in this new environment. So I'm hoping that the 13th of December will be well worth attending, as all these webinars are. But I think we'll learn something quite uplifting, which will be a good timing just ahead of Christmas. So as I say, a big thank you to George and Lynette. Thank you, as always, to Oxbury for sponsoring the webinar, and thank you all for attending, and I hope you've had a good evening, and we look forward to seeing you next month.